All right. Can you hear me all right? All right, cool. Thank you all for joining me this morning. Really a wonderful, diverse crowd. Really happy that y'all took the time to come and talk about overdose prevention in Vermont. As it's said before, my name is Ryan Fowler. I'm the harm reduction coordinator for the HIV/HCV Resource Center in Lebanon, New Hampshire. And we provide services to folks on both sides of the river in Vermont and New Hampshire who are living with or who are at risk for HIV or viral hepatitis. Um, I've been working with Melanie and Jill Lord and Ryan and some other folks on overdose prevention strategies in Vermont. Um, I'm coming out here from working in Manchester and Nashua and the Seacoast in New Hampshire. I'm born and raised a New Hampshire guy, um, and I'm also a person in recovery, and I'm going to get into that a little bit. And so this training here has been a kind of a work in progress over the past several years of entering into recovery, surviving multiple overdoses, being trained on how to use Narcan and how to dispense Narcan, and then kind of growing professionally and continuing to reach my full potential in recovery and updating this training time and time again. So it's kind of a work of art to me. It's kind of a work in progress. And I would really love for this content to kind of continue moving forward throughout for anybody who wants to use this content. So we are kind of talking about training folks to be delivering this training or something similar, kind of making it your own. But for today, we're going to talk about very briefly about my experience as a former injection drug user. We're going to talk about harm reduction as a really broad, universal concept that really we all use every day. And then we'll get more specific to harm reduction as it relates to people who use drugs, drug use, substance use disorders. And then we're going to look at how that ties really nicely into recovery and modalities of empowerment, like recovery-oriented systems. And we're going to talk a little bit about harm reduction services known as syringe services programs, like the ones that are offered through the HIV/HCV Resource Center. And from here on out, I'm going to say H2RC, and that's the acronym for the agency that myself and Ryan Richards work for. So we work with H2RC, and my primary professional role is operating and expanding the Claremont Exchange. It's a syringe services program on the New Hampshire side, and I do provide services in Windsor County as well, and Ryan and I kind of bounce back and forth. So we're going to talk about how that could look and how that could expand with the goal of preventing disease and giving people a pathway to recovery. And then, of course, we're going to talk about opioids, overdose prevention, and naloxone and how to use it. And, I wouldn't be surprised if most of you have learned how to use these nasal sprays, the Narcan nasal spray, but this goes a little depth. I do have you for a 90-minute period, so we'll definitely be wrapped up by 11:30. But I do want to touch on stimulants because we're seeing rising rates in stimulants, and we would really be missing the mark if we didn't include conversations about stimulants in an overdose prevention framework, because we're seeing more and more polysubstance use. And at least on the New Hampshire side, we're seeing more and more fatal overdoses from strictly meth or cocaine. And more people are polysubstance users. They're using more than one substance at a time, and that affects overdose prevention response. And then we're going to wrap up with some kind of ideas of supporting people who use drugs. Obviously, in a perfect world, everybody would enter recovery today, but that's not the reality for millions of Americans who are living with a use disorder or who use drugs and may not meet diagnostic criteria for a use disorder. There is a way to work with them. We call it harm reduction. We call it a lot of things. It's humanity, connecting with people. And then there'll be time at the end for questions. And as Melanie had said, we're going through this to give people a space to make comments or questions. And I would certainly encourage you to put your questions or comments into the chat. I can't really get to them immediately, but I will keep tabs on the chat as we go through this, and especially at the end. it's a good way to be heard. And so, yeah, definitely make yourself comfortable, ask those questions. And really, it's really there are no questions that are off the table. I'm very out my life. I'm a former injection drug user. I both used and sold drugs throughout New Hampshire for a little over 10 years, and I've been in recovery for 5.5. It'll be 6 years in December. Um, I was born to a middle class family. I had some trauma issues. I had some issues of neglect and alcoholism and addiction in my home. And I was very adamantly opposed to taking drugs or alcohol as a child and going into high school. But I had underlying like PTSD issues and anxiety disorder that I didn't know how to talk about. I wasn't aware of mental health or counseling. My only drug education in middle school told me that people did drugs because users, and that people were gonna every now and again jump out of an alleyway and try to give me free drugs to intentionally ruin my life. And like neither of those things happened, but my experience with taking drugs was that it served a purpose. It kind of did for me what society wasn't doing for me. It kind of gave me what I wasn't getting at home, a sense of comfort and ease. And I wasn't aware that I was treating anxiety or PTSD, but once I started to experiment with alcohol and cannabis, prescription pills, on and on and on, anything I was told to deter me from using drugs was thrown out the window. And then I found selling drugs in high school, and that really gave me kind of a social one up. That really helped me to connect with people and have a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose. And really, after being sober for a year or two, I really looked at the fact that any human behavior serves a purpose. And anything I was doing was living in a tent and injecting cocaine, like you see in the second picture here, or really anything really. And my recovery journey after going to rehab for the fourth time, being saved by naloxone for the third time, was really filling in the gaps that were left when I took drugs and alcohol out of the equation. Drugs and alcohol were serving a purpose in my life, and I know now, having been in recovery for multiple years and getting into addiction treatment and recovery, I've consistently used my negative experience to help others. And this third picture here is myself and two first responders who were at my last overdose in 2014. They actually saw me in an overdose event. They administered naloxone, brought me to the hospital. And about 3 or maybe 4 years later, I was doing some compassion fatigue training for first responders in Hampton. And at the end of the last of 4 presentations for fire and police, these two guys came up to me and said, "We actually remember you." And we really got into storytelling and the healing power of storytelling that has been used by our ancestors for all of history. When we really built empathy, because while of course there's stigma against people who use drugs, there's also stigma against first responders that I have a lot of. I have my own experience and my own beliefs, and I work through that, and I constantly try to live with radical compassion, like we learn about in harm reduction, and really, really seeing that, we're all in this for the same reason. And that's, to help people to, reach their full potential and enter recovery in some way. And that's really why I kind of naturally drifted towards harm reduction, like what I'm doing today with operating a syringe services program. Because not only am I alive because of naloxone, I come from a social circle of people who are alive because of naloxone, but I'm also healthy because of harm reduction. Two people in my early 20s, when I was a chaotic injection drug users, introduced me to a drug education I needed, provided me with sterile syringes, and helped me to prevent disease and help me to stay alive, because dead people don't enter recovery. And with harm reduction, all drug related death and disease is preventable. But really, when we hear harm reduction, I think it elicits a certain image in our mind. It might be people like Jesse in the Church of Safe Injection on the left giving out free Narcan in the streets. It might be people like Dave Purchase giving out syringes and condoms during the HIV crisis in the 80s in Tacoma, Washington. And it's really because of pioneers like Dave Purchase and Jesse Harvey that we've been able to mitigate multiple epidemics or pandemics, or a syndemic, as we're talking about. We have COVID-19, we have the overdose crisis, we have substance use disorder, viral hepatitis, HIV, endocarditis, on and on and on. And this is all preventable. And, the CDC predicts that 75,000 people will die of drug poisoning in 2020. And that's 75,000 preventable deaths. And the truth is that, a lot of people in our society believe that death is an acceptable consequence of using drugs. And like my friend Jesse on the left has said, people who use drugs do not deserve to die. And so if we bring harm reduction or healthcare to people to help them to stay alive, to find recovery, it works out a lot nicer for everybody. And so, but harm reduction is really a universal concept that we use every day. It's just practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing negative consequences associated with risky behavior. Or really any human behavior has risk associated to it, whether that's breathing air, walking down the road, injecting methamphetamine. Anything human has risk associated to it. And there's a way to reduce risk and reduce harms. And really the thing, people don't do things for no reason. I know that I don't want my friends to jump out of an airplane, but if they do, I want them to wear a parachute. That's harm reduction, and I acknowledge that there's a reason they're jumping out of that airplane. For the dopamine, adrenaline, and the experience, it's similar to drugs. And same too with motorcycles. I've lost two close loved ones to motorcycle accidents, and if I was wizard and master of the world, I would say people shouldn't ride motorcycles because I have no business being on one. But that's kind of malarkey. Like I would never impede on someone's freedom. And I also acknowledge that people like my stepdad and my uncle, that's like their drug. Like that's their high, getting on their Harley and going out. But, I don't like the sound of it. They make me uncomfortable. I've driven a Harley. I have no business being on one, but I acknowledge to use it, they should practice harm reduction. Maybe wear a helmet, inspect their vehicle, make sure they're being safe, follow the laws that protect us all. And so harm reduction is universal and extends to drug use. Would somebody care to volunteer to read this definition of harm reduction? Just to break up my voice a bit.
Sure. According to Harm Reduction International, harm reduction is a set of evidence-based practices that minimize the negative impacts of drug use and ineffective drug policies. Harm reduction is grounded in principles that protect human rights and improve public health. It incorporates a wide array of approaches, including abstinence, designed to meet people where they are and offer opportunities for people to improve their health and well-being.
Thank you. I like this definition a lot because, I think everybody has a different definition of harm reduction. And I would really encourage folks on the call to think about what your definition of harm reduction is at the end of this. And, there's some conversation about capital H, capital R, like big harm reduction being about being a social movement for freedom and the rights of people who use drugs. And then there's harm reduction, the practical strategies and ideas that we'll get into. But really, drug use is something that's always happened. There's actually no recorded human history without drug use of some kind. As far as the earliest recorded history of humanity includes taking drugs. And really, drugs were celebrated throughout many indigenous cultures throughout the world and still are today in many places. But throughout the world, we really only know prohibition. We really only know, punishing people to deter them from using and selling drugs. And what we learned in the 20s and 30s is that prohibition doesn't work, but we still really ramp up the war on drugs and we criminalize people for their behavior. We say that, this is not acceptable to us and we wish this to stop. And so we criminalize people face stigma and discrimination and oppression. And there's no human history without drug users of some kind. And it's really hard to confront this under the paradigm of prohibition and the war on drugs. But harm reduction is oftentimes a response to something. So it might be a response to prohibition or a response to HIV or COVID-19 or viral hepatitis, harm reduction really works to insulate people from some of the systemic inequities that come from criminalizing people who use drugs or really just society at large. And it really emphasizes that we all have a relationship to drugs, and that includes abstinence. So avoiding drugs is still a relationship to drugs. And, drug use is really kind of ubiquitous in our society. Obviously, alcohol, caffeine, nicotine. More people than ever are using drugs, more people than ever are addicted to drugs, and more people than ever are overdosing on drugs. And those were the things we were trying to reduce with prohibition and the war on drugs and the continued attempts to punish people to stop. And what we really see is that it has a negative impact on people. And it's actually contrary to everything we know about substance use disorders. We define a use disorder as continuing to use despite negative consequences, but we consistently offer negative consequences to deter people from using. And it really, mitigates public health, and it's really doesn't make a lot of sense. And this training really started with me using my lived experience and seeing, a lot of injustice and a lot of preventable death and suffering. And so this may turn into a vent session for me, and I'm happy to really open this up if folks have questions or comments they want to pop into the chat. But really, we're going to focus primarily on harm reduction, delivering to people. So practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing negative consequences of drug use. Of course, I mentioned it as a social movement built on the belief in and respect for the rights of people who use drugs. But for today, we're primarily going to focus on the direct strategies and interventions and ways to support people. Of course, my war on drugs tangent comes out here and there, and I don't necessarily have a solution. Like, I don't think, and we'll kind of get into this in a second, actually. So the strategy of harm reduction, as I talked about, is the goal is to reduce mortality, prevent death and disease, and that's providing access to cost-free naloxone. That's primarily why we're here. Giving people evidence-based treatment options and saying, here are your options, and honoring people's dignity and agency to define what treatment and recovery path works for them. We say it's all pathways of recovery, but it's really when it comes down to it, people have very few options of what may or may not work for them. And so really the innovations I've seen in New Hampshire have been wonderful. People are, coming to our hub and spoke model, which we modeled after Vermont's hub and spoke, and they're given options. But when I was seeking treatment, all 4 times, I was kind of told, go to whatever you can find. Salvation Army, clinical, 12-step, just go to whatever you can get into. And that's really not. And in fact, we really don't treat these issues like healthcare issues because we treat them like a crime, and we really can't have that 2 ways. You can't call it a disease or a health condition and treat it like a crime. And so a lot of this is having conversations about innovating crisis response and looking at, having healthcare professionals work with healthcare issues. And I see this as a healthcare issue, not a criminal justice issue, but we're far from that point. And really, I'm really happy that there's such a diverse crowd here today on this call. And I'm going to be a little more concise with going through this so that we can open it up for some questions and comments. And harm reduction looks at people's needs and treats them with dignity and respect, and looks at housing as a very large determinant of health. And it's actually maybe one of the biggest determining factors for successful recovery. So housing first models is about giving people housing without contingencies. And what we see for the most at-risk populations is that if they're housed, they're practicing sleep hygiene, they're accounted for, they're safe, and the other services work a lot better. But you're really not going to get well sleeping under a bush or in a tent. And, with the increase in homelessness, we really need to be looking at harm reduction housing or housing first models to support people, because nobody in America should freeze to death sleeping outside. I'll just leave that one there. Of course, I've talked about this quite a bit. Criminal justice reform, drug policy reform. I love the middle of the road approach. I don't think that legalization would work today, tomorrow, or the next day, but we really need to look at, the re-traumatization that happens when people are criminalized for their health condition. And I've seen it have a really negative impact and a positive impact too. Like there needs to be interventions of some kind, and building reduction principles into interventions is very effective. And we're going to get into that in just a bit. Um, Syringe services programs are a big part of harm reduction. We also call them needle exchange programs. And the federal government and we at H2RC prefer syringe services programs or SSP. So if I say SSP, that's syringe services programs, because it's a wider range of services, not just syringes. We provide, peer-to-peer support. We provide referrals and sources. We provide naloxone, drug testing equipment like fentanyl test strips. We provide disease testing prior to COVID. Hopefully, again, soon we'll be testing people. And it's an access point to a lot of different services. Um, On-site drug checking, like I talked about, giving people fentanyl test strips to know what's in their bag. Because in a criminal drug market, there's no FDA, there's no label on your drugs, and we're losing a lot of people to contaminated drugs, stimulants being fentanyl. And really, it's, the idea of giving people fentanyl test strips to test their supply isn't really built on they're going to throw their drugs away, but it's that they're going to make better choices and practice harm reduction. If they know there's fentanyl in it, they're going to go slow, they're going to carry naloxone, and hopefully have someone check in on them, because supervised use or consumption sites or injection sites are in the news more and more. But when I'm in New England or in America in 2020 talking about supervised use, I'm really talking about creating a culture of people who don't use drugs alone. Because anytime somebody I love died of an overdose, they were alone and behind a closed door because of stigma. And, stigma we talk about quite a bit in this kind of professional world, but it's really a nice way to talk about discrimination and oppression. Like stigma is kind of how we feel. Discrimination is stigma in action. And it's really, there's a lot to this, but that's kind of a basic overview of a harm strategy. And before I get too crazy sounding and really going off, I'd like to make some disclaimers about harm reduction. And as I said, this isn't about legalization or a conversation about really drug policy changes. It's really just acknowledging that drug use happens. It's not condoning, endorsing, or encouraging use. And it's not getting people who have stopped using or who have never used to start using again. It's about creating a pathway of recovery and to recovery, a pathway to healthcare, supporting people, meeting them where they're at, and not leaving them there. It's about meeting people where they're at and educating them and empowering them to make better decisions. And it's certainly not saying anything goes or whatever happens, happens. This isn't a free for all. This is a public health framework that's built on 30 plus years of research and evidence. And it's really creating a pathway to a better life for people who are really marginalized and living in the shadows. And really, I said, it sounds like from the folks who are on the call, we would love everybody using drugs in Vermont or New Hampshire around the world to find recovery. When I talk to people who are still using, who have been exposed to systems, they have a very interesting definition of recovery that's oftentimes in their mind connected to like court mandated 12-step meetings. And so they have this interesting aversion or this institutional trauma that comes out. And so a lot of people engaged with the Claremont Exchange, at least at first, had a strong aversion to a lot of recovery and treatment stuff because, like, if I'm being honest, like a lot of it's not great. Like it's great for a lot of people, but for really high need or at risk folks, treatment kind of misses the mark for a lot of people. But recovery is a natural thing that happens in a lot of the more recent research on use disorders and recovery. Are finding that most people in recovery never went to treatment or never went to rehab, residential. People kind of find it on their own, specifically these age points around 25 years old and 35 years old, where hormones change, priorities change, and life fills up. And people simply go through this process of change where individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. I like this a lot because at 5.5 going on 6 years sober, I can still live a more self-directed life. I can still improve by 1% wherever I can, however I can. And I can always reach my full potential because for me, I believe that my potential is limitless. But for many people, their full potential may include self-medicating or living a life of moderating drugs or alcohol. Um, and really, it's tough to have those conversations in our kind of paradigm understanding drug use. And drugs, by all means, lump alcohol or anything that you're more familiar with into this to kind of use as a lens. I'm going to assume most people on the call haven't spent years injecting heroin like I have. And so it might be kind of hard to envision moderation, but I think using like alcohol or cannabis or something that someone's more familiar with on for these concepts really makes it easier to understand. And really, what is true is that beings are born abstinent of drug taking behavior. Like nobody is born and starts taking drugs right away on their own. Of course, there is neonatal abstinence syndrome, which is a tragedy and a growing tragedy. And there's a whole other conversation on that I'm not going to touch today. But many people, I would say the large majority of people, experiment with alcohol or drugs at some point. Some people experiment and never try it again. Some people become occasional or social drinkers or drug users. Um, and a lot less people ever even consider moderation or having to set personal limits on their alcohol or drug use. And if we look at some of the long-term studies specifically on alcohol use disorder, 10 or 20 years, they're finding that moderation is actually the most common outcome, more common than abstinence in a lot of these cross sections of people. But I never heard that M word, 4 tries at treatment. It was really, it was all or nothing. It was you're abstinent or you're chaotic. But actually, what we know is that right now, the estimate is that 16% of housed Americans will meet criteria for a substance use disorder. So that's like heavy, chaotic, dangerous substance use. But we really kind of only see it as abstinent or substance use. But most people who use drugs don't have a use disorder. And the medicalization of this is great. But really, if we use this continuum and we kind of see people as shifting, one way or the other, it makes a lot more sense. And you want to talk about use disorder as a chronic health issue or a health condition or a disease or whatever makes sense for you to call it. If we talk about any other chronic health issue, it's incremental change steps, any steps in the right direction, person driven, goal setting, goal achieving, and steps to reducing risk, reducing symptoms. But we don't treat use disorders like this very often, or at least until more recently. We really tell people you're using excessively, go to this 28-day program and be abstinent. And we define people's goals for them. And if we talk to people, and I was kind of told this for a long time in and out of recovery, is that, if you're going to every day, like what's the point? Or, a drug is a drug is a drug, and one leads to the other, leads to the other, leads to the other. But, my experience is that, I use cannabis recreationally without any sort of, chaotic or heavy, dangerous use. I go to a store in Massachusetts, I buy a thing legally, I come home, I use it after work sometimes, and I have yet to have an urge to go back to heroin or cocaine. It actually has helped me with creativity and stress management. It serves a purpose in my life. And is it perfect? No. Could I have done that without multiple years of abstinence? No, but really, I had to find a forum for open and honest conversations about my mental health, about, everything I kind of talked about a little bit with the trauma stuff. And, I found a really welcoming community in the harm reduction community that really explained these concepts to me. And it's really helped me to support people in my life who have slip ups, who have trials. And, this is a relapsing chronic health condition, but it's about celebrating any positive change or any steps in the right direction. And really, I know plenty of people on different steps here, there, everywhere, but we really have designed systems of treatment and recovery to deal with the acute care for heavy, chronic or heavy drug use. And so we tell people, go to treatment. You're going to come out. You're going to love your life. You're going to work. You're going to play. You're going to have housing, faith, and belonging. But we don't see very great success rates for treatment, like long term. But what we do see working is our recovery oriented systems where the needs of an individual are met and they're able to define what it is they want to work on and fill the gaps in their life. And when we take drugs out of the equation for people who are using to self-medicate, we see that we leave gaps in their life and we send them back on their way, and they need to fill those gaps. And so really sometimes it's about acknowledging people's strengths and having a strength-based approach and going in the right direction based on their have the right to work on their health or their social connection or their spirituality, housing and food. And we can kind of use this as a tool for people with use disorders to figure out what is important to them. And my experience being in recovery and other people I know in recovery is that once you fill in the world around you, drug use doesn't fit in. There's no real need to self-medicate if I had my needs met. And, my success in recovery does have a bit to do with my social privilege. I had a family that could house me after my fourth rehab attempt. I got alternative sentencing rather than a felony conviction. I kind of got lucky, and I had some social privilege that allowed me to fill in the world around me and enter into this space professionally. Really talking about harm reduction, which I'm obviously very passionate about. I meant to open it up for questions or comments a bit back. Anything that comes to mind that folks want to share before we get into like delivering harm reduction services and naloxone to folks? You can always type it into the chat if you're, yeah, thank you, Melanie. So harm reduction, the goal is to improve the health and well-being of individuals and the community around them, and also to address the roles of discrimination due to poverty, racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, isolation, trauma, and other inequalities and drug-related harm. That's a lot to unpack, and I'm not saying that we need to solve these issues, but for harm reduction philosophy, it's about showing people dignity and respect and empowering them to reduce harms and live a more self-directed life, reach their full potential, and improve their health and well-being. And really, this kind of capital H, capital R harm reduction stuff at the bottom is important because in treatment systems, we're kind of told, you have a disease, it's chronic, potentially fatal, and you're powerless over this. And the issue is you, and it's work on you. And that is right to a point. But really, there wasn't a space to talk about, discrimination or homophobia or racism. And for some people who are using drugs, that might be a really big factor in their self-medicating. Because again, people use drugs for a reason. People don't do things for no reason. And if we're leaving conversations out about different types of discrimination or bigotry, we're really not allowing people to, explore what it is that's motivating them to use drugs. And, once I realized why I was using the mental health stuff, the self-medicating stuff, the role of dopamine, it helped me understand why I could do $100 in cocaine and $100 in heroin every day, but I couldn't feed myself or house myself. And so really it's about open and honest conversations and allowing people to be heard, especially the most vulnerable or marginalized in our society. Because treatment works great for a lot of people, but what I see is that people with a lot of co-occurring issues have a hard time having their needs met, and they end up in homeless encampments or dead or in jail or prison. And it's really unfortunate that a lot of this is preventable, but there's just a lot of inequity in our society. And how do we solve inequity? I don't know. I have another 45 minutes with you. I don't know if you have any good ideas to solve inequity in 45 minutes, but it's about not focusing so much on the big, the capital H, capital R, the politics, the world. It's about focusing on the person in front of us who we're trying to support, who's having struggles with addiction, opioids, or whatever, and showing them dignity and respect and allowing them to find their autonomy and agency, and asking them open-ended questions like motivational interviewing techniques. Rather than telling them what they need or want, ask them what they want their future to look like. What do you want to work on? And rather than telling them if you leave, you're done, if you leave, I want you to come back anytime. And these are things on the left here, the traditional system working in treatment. I've said all those things basically time and time again. We reinforce these things, but people are oftentimes using for the illusion of control or the autonomy or agency or freedom that comes with using drugs. And so a prescriptive or punitive approach is really contrary to what it is that their goals are. And, if we're defining people's goals for them, we're kind of failing them right off the rip. And so for recovery coaching, the question I was started to build into like peer support when I was working at recovery centers in New Hampshire. Right off the rip, first session, is it your goal to be abstinent? Like what motivates you to change? And really getting into it of, what are the benefits of your drug use? Like you've been told why it's bad and why you're having problems, but what are the benefits to it? Like what motivates you to use this? And I could have two people who use the same drugs the same way every day, and one may be using the opioids to treat physical pain. One might be treating voices in their head. They might use opioids to make the voices in their head slow down or stop. And that's two different recovery pathways to me. Like they could be basically the same, but if people are using drugs for different reasons, then they're going to have different gap fillers. Like when we talked about that recovery oriented system and the world around somebody, if drugs, buying, seeking, selling, thinking about is half of your circles, you need to fill that, but you can't fill that unless you know the purpose of the behavior. And so, harm reduction really asks people open-ended questions. How are you staying safe? Not just saying, go be safe, go be well, but asking them. And it's that process of self-discovery that people go through where, my experience coaching moderation management is that most people end up on stable ground abstinence because they figured it out on their own. It wasn't me telling them that you can't use drugs in safety. It was creating a plan, setting personal limits, maybe staying within those personal limits, but most of the time, those personal limits that they defined were exceeded. And that is there's a lot of learning here to moderation management. And so, this is a big part of harm reduction. Really, abstinence is great and I love it. It's the best policy, but, that's not an option for everybody today. And so as we get a little bit more specific into harm reduction and working with people who use drugs or who once used drugs, we again strive for any positive change. There's no contingencies or ultimatum or coercion. It's about supporting people and not punishing them. Because generally, people who use illegal drugs are punished or criminalized or marginalized, from the time they wake up to the time they go to bed. And sometimes just that, open ear, that, bearing witness to suffering and, meeting people where they're at and hearing them out is a really therapeutic for people who aren't having coherent conversations day in and day out. And really, it's, as far as really, I really like the philosophy that harm reduction really addresses drug use in an evidence-based and fact-based ways and gives people a real drug education that they likely never received. Really looking at not just the drug itself, but also the set. So like someone's personal physiology or biology or kind of what motivates them to use the drug, their expectations of using the drug, and also the setting in which the drug is used. So that could be stressors, could be socioeconomic, supports or lack thereof, and also the cultural attitudes towards the drug and its users. And if we use this framework, we can mitigate harm in various ways. So if the person's not ready to stop using drugs, we can ask them, where are you using or how are you using? And can we reduce harm in routes of administration or various different techniques like that? And I've kind of eaten up a lot of my time here, I know. So the goal of harm reduction is also to prevent disease, specifically bloodborne pathogens from injection drug use. So HIV has been popping up in throughout New England. And, the reason that SSPs are funded is primarily to save people from contracting HIV or viral hepatitis. Every adult American in their life should be tested at least once for HIV and viral hepatitis C because rates are so high and it's spread in various ways. Of course, beyond injection drug use, you can contract these diseases through sharing snorting utensils, having sex. They're bloodborne, but really what we're seeing from injection drug use is a lot of soft tissue infections like endocarditis and cellulitis and other really yucky, expensive to treat health conditions that could be mitigated or prevented with very cheap interventions of providing people with sterile supplies and providing them with education to protect themselves. Services programs come in. SSPs work to promote public health and safety by taking used syringes off the streets. They protect first responders from needle stick injuries. They do not increase crime or drug use, and they create a pathway to recovery. And what research shows, and I'm really talking about 30 plus years of research and evidence, there's never been a study that said these are a bad idea. And there's been a lot of studies in a lot of different ways that say that these decrease new infectious disease cases. They save a lot of money. There's opportunities for multiple interventions. And what the most recent findings show is that people who inject drugs are 5 times more likely to access substance use treatment and 3 times more likely to stop injecting if engaged with an SSP. And that's my experience coming out to Claremont and now getting into Sullivan County, Grafton County, and Windsor County, is that, you know, people, if given an education and resources, will take that step. But what I see are people living in the shadows who aren't open to a recovery center, who aren't open to going to a treatment center. But, you know, the syringes are really great engagement tool. People come for the syringe and they stay for the peer support. They're now open to access to healthcare, wound care, disease testing, overdose prevention strategies, crisis intervention, care coordination, so referrals to treatment and healthcare. And it's really this beautiful thing that happens where people don't even realize that it's an intervention, and people are coming because you give them free clean syringes and Narcan and test strips and et cetera. But over time, when you medicalize these issues, drug use starts to suck. And I say that kind of candidly. Like, once you start to, you know, use a new alcohol pad every time, use a new syringe every time, you bring the medical into it, and people start to acknowledge that their behavior serves a purpose, right? So maybe they've had that conversation and they see maybe it's trauma, maybe it's physical pain. It's not so much why the painkiller, but why the pain. And once they realize what the purpose is, they're more likely to connect their consequences or their negative outcomes to their behavior. Because when we see people who don't seem to be connecting their problems with substance use to their substance use, it's because the purpose of the behavior is so ingrained in their brain, it's hard for them to see it. And so harm reduction kind of subtly educates people. And I've seen so many people stop injecting with the Claremont Exchange and kind of going out and, you know, for me, my day-to-day life is I know hub and spoke, I know 211, I know MAT, I know treatment options. They don't. And sometimes me saying things to them that are so obvious to me means I never see them again. And for a syringe service program, that's a good thing. And I hear time and time again, they've been see them in the streets. You know, I hear they're at the recovery center or doing this, that, the other thing. It's really an effective way to very subtly evangelize recovery and treatment to people without them even knowing it. SSPs are endorsed by all these wonderful agencies and organizations throughout the world. So if you don't, you know, agree with myself, I hope you like maybe 1 or 2 of these agencies up here listed. And so now comes the point where we talk about opioids, overdose prevention and response. Anybody have a question or a comment so far before we get into the actual overdose prevention training? Well, again, we can, you know, I'll check the chat periodically. And perfect, yeah. So these are some graphs with big numbers of people who die from overdoses. And each of those numbers is a human being with, you know, family and loved ones and connections whose needs were not met. You know, anybody who's died of an overdose, their needs were not met in some way, because with harm reduction, all of this is preventable. That's 75,000 that could be saved this year with effective harm reduction strategies. And yet we continue to, you know, beat the drum of the war on drugs and do things that we know don't work. But here we are losing people to preventable death. And, you know, I'm pretty certain that we all know like what an opioid is to a point, but the opioid receptors in our brains are really important for many parts of human existence and experience, like connection or pain relief or, engaging with people. Our body produces its own opioids. And an opioid, as you can see at the top, is any agent that binds to opioid receptors in the body and creates a response. So When we found endorphins, we actually created the term endorphin for endogenous morphine. We knew that our body produced endogenous pain relievers. So when you're in physical pain or in various other types of emotional pain, you get your own opioids that kind of activate. They're endorphins. And for about 5,000 years, people have used exogenous or external opioids from the opium poppy. In more recent human history, we've used semi-synthetics like heroin or oxycodone, hydrocodone, buprenorphine, etc. And really, what we're seeing now are fully synthetic or fully man-made opioids hitting the drug market, specifically fentanyl, very short-acting, very potent opioids that are killing a lot of people. Opioids are very different, opioid to opioid, because the gold standard for treating opioid use disorder is methadone. And methadone is a long-acting opioid that lasts almost 24 hours and is very great treatment for pain and to, fight crave opioid use disorder. Fentanyl is a very short-acting, very, very, very potent, very, very deadly opioid that's killing a lot of people. And it's really, that's what we're dealing with. I'm not going to get into why it's here, why I think opioids do a lot of things in the brain, but really they block pain signals, they slow down your brain and slow down your breathing and slow down your digestive tract. It's a depressant. So it slows everything down. And at higher levels, it can produce calming, antidepressant effects, drowsiness. A lot of people get nervous or itchy or irritable. But for people like myself who have a natural endorphin deficiency, I was predetermined that when I tried opioids, I was going to really like it because it gave me a lot of dopamine. And dopamine does a lot of things in the brain, but really it reinforces life-sustaining activities. So in order for our species to survive, our brain gives us dopamine when we eat food, drink water, have sex, care for children, seek shelter to prolong the species. But drugs like opioids or stimulants, other addictive drugs, they give you more dopamine than you would ever really get naturally. And it reinforces drug taking behavior as a life sustaining activity. And so that's why, 6 years ago, I was homeless, couldn't feed myself, couldn't house myself, would rather shoot coke and heroin alone than deal with people. But I was so driven by obtaining and using these drugs that I couldn't really see beyond that until, I had, a really great intervention, actually by police. I got alternative sentencing and sent to treatment for the fourth time. And that fourth time in treatment is where I learned this stuff. I don't really like thinking of myself of having a disease or, I don't really like to think of myself like that. I have a condition that's preventable and treatable and can go into remission. I understand the role of dopamine. And, for me, early recovery was like going ziplining and going hiking and doing things that give me natural dopamine that weren't drugs, alcohol, or sex. Like those things are fine in moderation, maybe for some, maybe not. But for me, it was, finding freedom and, things that filled the gaps of dopamine. Uh, and so opioids enter the body, they slow down the brain. And if you take too much of an opioid, it goes all the way back to the brain stem and overwhelms the system and suppresses the body's urge to breathe. So an overdose event for opioids is an oxygen event or a respiratory event. It's the brain, slowing down from the front all the way to the back, and the brain stem tells the body to do things without us thinking about it, like breathing or digesting food. And so really when we see an overdose, we're seeing a person who's unable to breathe on their own. Overdoses can happen instantly, like right at the scene, or they can evolve over several hours, especially with polysubstance use. So if somebody has a stimulant on board, too much of an opioid, they might be fine until the stimulant wears off a bit, and then the brain is depressed to a point where the brain is not telling the lungs to breathe. But people can evolve into an overdose event over several hours, but most commonly it's pretty quickly after they use too much of an opioid. An opioid event is oxygen event. So think about somebody who's not getting enough oxygen. Of course, they're unconscious or unresponsive. They may be awake but unable to talk. Their breathing will be shallow or kind of a gurgling or snoring sound that's really unpleasant. Their complexion will be pale or ashen or blue, depending on their melanin or their race. People will look different, but again, lack of oxygen. They could be vomiting. They could be limp or rigid. Their pulse will be slow, erratic, or stopped. And if you lift eyelids, they'll have pinned pupils. And it could be any combination of these things. But really, if we find and we believe that they may be experiencing an overdose, we really want to give them naloxone, also known as the name brand Narcan. Um, and really, what is naloxone? It's an opioid antagonist or a blocker. So it enters the brain and binds to those opioid receptors where opioids attach to, and kicks opioids off of those receptors in the brain and allows the person experiencing an overdose the ability to breathe on their own again. Um, Naloxone is not scheduled. It's legal for anyone to possess, carry, and use. I've never heard of a reason to not give a human being naloxone, including children, including really anybody. And actually, Jerome Adams, the Surgeon General, encourages every American to carry naloxone during the overdose crisis because anyone, anytime can save a life. And so that might be in a parking lot, that might be in your neighborhood. And really want to emphasize that naloxone is really unpleasant, even if you have no opioids in your system, because you have opioid receptors. So naloxone is really unpleasant. It makes you feel hot and cold and sweaty and shivering. And if you're coming back from an overdose, imagine that your brain was completely turned off and then it turns back on 0 to 60 with no executive functioning, no memory recall, physically very painful because if you block your opioid receptors, you have more pain signals going off. And so no one's having Narcan parties where they intentionally overdose and bring themselves back. One of the worst experiences of my life. I'm very grateful that first responders saved my life 3 different times with naloxone, but it wasn't pleasant. And I don't know anybody who would ever do it again intentionally. So please, be giving people naloxone. And the person who's most likely to use this medication is a person who uses drugs. Of course, anybody should carry it. It comes in various forms, but for this project with the Overdose to Action project in Windsor County, you mostly have access to nasal Narcan, the name brand. They're very easy to use nasal sprays. And so if we think somebody's overdosing, how do we respond? It's going to be stimulation first. Narcan is not your first line of defense. It's yell, I'm going to Narcan you, or the police are coming, wake up. Don't respond to that. You might give them a sternal rub. So taking your middle knuckles and just rubbing their sternum. If you do it to yourself, it hurts a little bit, but if someone else does it to you, it hurts quite a bit. It sends nerve signals from your sternum up to your brain. And if somebody doesn't respond to a sternal rub, call 911. There's something going on if somebody doesn't wake up to one of those. And it's really great if somebody's sleeping in the office next to you, give them one of those and wake them up. Pretty effective. If they don't respond, we're going to want to call 911 and administer naloxone. So at this point, it's important to avoid a crowd. You don't want a group of people around this person. Into that in a minute. But you want to clear a crowd. Somebody call 911 and administer naloxone. That could be, I've done both at the same time. I've been on my cell phone administering naloxone. I've also had somebody call while I'm with the person, responding to them. But really, if you do one thing and one thing only, it's get the medical professionals there because there could be a lot going on with this situation. And, part of recognizing an overdose event is recognizing that people make decisions based on their circumstances. And there's a lot more than just what we're seeing in this picture here of somebody who's overdosed. There's a lot more to that. But it can be frustrating when people are constantly overdosing repeated time and time again. But it's really no time is too many. We really need to keep people alive to reach their full potential because they're human beings. So if we have our nasal Narcan on hand, which of course we do, I carry it like this. I don't know if you can see me, but I kind of rubber band the 2 nasal sprays together outside the box. And it's very simple. If you have your 2 doses of naloxone, you take your one, you peel it open, you place it in their nostril, and you press the trigger. So you peel the package, you place it in their nostril, make sure they're facing upright, and so that, when you are going to spray this nasal spray in their nose, it's going to kind of stay up in their mucous membranes, and you're going to press the trigger. Please don't press the trigger prior, because if you press this enough, all 4 milligrams shoot right up into the air, and then that's a wasted dose. But once it's in the nostril, press the trigger. And the hardest part is waiting because nasal Narcan takes 3 minutes to even start working because it's going to go from the mucous membranes to the blood to the brain. And so you hear people who give 4 doses in 3 minutes and then they come back and the person's very sick and irritable. But sometimes it's about, keeping a timer because that 3 minutes could seem like eternity. If they do respond, they'll regain consciousness, their breathing will improve, their color will come back. EMS will arrive and support them. primarily what they're going to do is offer oxygen support with a bag valve mask, make sure that, use an oximeter to see what their blood oxygen is. If they respond, let them know what happened. Remember that their brain has been turned off. And so sometimes in that first hour after an overdose, saying less is better. You may have overdosed. I gave you Narcan and you came back. Narcan only lasts 30 to 90 minutes. So it takes 3 minutes to work, and it only blocks the opioids for 30 to 90 minutes. So people could overdose on the opioids that are already in their system. And so that's why it's important to get medical professionals there. And also let people know that they'll start to feel better in about 30 minutes because the naloxone starts to wear off and their body kind of comes back to homeostasis because they're in what's called precipitated withdrawal, and they may really want to use drugs again. But if they can wait out that 30 to 90 minutes, they'll feel a lot better. You gotta let them know, like I said, they may still overdose and we need medical attention. If their breathing improves, but they're not fully responsive, remember your recovery positions, putting people on their side, kind of like I sleep like this quite a bit with their hands down, so that if they vomit, they're going to be facing outwards and down so that they don't choke if they were to vomit, because it's not uncommon for people to vomit in these situations. There's a lot going on with their brain and body. So recovery position, I put somebody to bed who's drank way too much, recovery position. If we think somebody is slightly unconscious or inebriated and they're going to go to bed, recovery position. It's a really, really good tool to have. If their breathing doesn't improve, though, and you're comfortable and trained and have a CPR mask or a rescue breathing mask, you can breathe for them using your oxygen and rescue breathing or mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. So make sure there's nothing in their mouth. Use a finger sweep. You're going to lift their head back, lift their chin, hold their nose, and through your rescue breathing mask, you can give them 2 full breaths of your oxygen into their lungs. And you can kind of see their chest rise and their complexion come back a bit. And you can do that again, 1 breath every 5 seconds indefinitely to keep people alive. And really important, preventing brain damage and preventing anoxic brain injury. And I know somebody who was saved by just rescue breathing, no naloxone, no 911. The rescue breathing is a really important tool to learn, but this isn't for everybody. Not everybody's comfortable delivering this, but it's something to keep in your back pocket. And so being trained in CPR is very important when we talk about this. So as I said, the rescue breathing, a chest will rise. If they stop breathing and you feel like it's, and you're certified, you can do full CPR chest compressions to kind of jumpstart the heart and cardiovascular system. I'm not a CPR trainer. This is not a CPR training, but it's important to, if we're going to be really responding to this, CPR is very important. And if 2 to 3 minutes has passed without any changes, we can give the second dose. So again, peel it, place it, press it in the nostril, peel it, place it in the nostril, and press the trigger. Just a recap, know the signs. So recognize the signs, recognize that people, make decisions based on their circumstances, and respond. So stimulation, call 911, administer naloxone, rescue breathing, recovery position, soft messaging afterwards, and recover. Give them a chance to, have their brain come back on, give them some water, give them supportive messaging. This is just an image of opioid receptors, opioids, and the naloxone coming in to reverse the effects of opioids. And the aftercare stuff is important, and I know that it's been a conversation in Windsor County because it can be really traumatic and really a chaotic experience to see. And really, there's a lot to unpack there, but sometimes it's just about being present and, allowing people to be heard. And it's not really the time to be talking about treatment and recovery until their brains had a few hours to kind of come back on. But really, it's, about having them feel supported and connected to people and showing them compassion. And that's radical compassion because this is frustrating. Like, I've been very frustrated saving someone's life with naloxone, but they're alive today. So harm reduction techniques for overdose response is, again, dignity and respect. Ask them what they want before assuming what they need. Be practical and realistic. I kind of already talked about that stuff a bit. Overdose and brain injury is on the rise. What we see are people who are constantly overdosing or relapsing that are actually living with anoxic brain injuries from oxygen deprivation. So the parts of the brain that are really important for substance use recovery, attention, memory, executive functioning, etc., are also impacted by anoxic brain injuries, lack of oxygen, or hypoxic brain injuries, low oxygen over a long period of time. So, what if somebody uses a depressant every day for 20 years? What is their blood oxygen? I don't really know, but there's a lot to be said about people's brain injuries and their struggles with substance use treatment and recovery. And so sometimes it's identifying this for somebody and asking them, have you been out for more than 3 minutes for an overdose? Have you ever considered having a brain injury? And getting them to a neurologist to check that out, because their recovery and treatment may be very different than your traditional approach. All 3 times I was saved by naloxone. It was a pretty quick response. I hope I don't have any real brain injury, but I may never know. And so I talked a lot about calling 911 during an overdose event where there's illegal drugs. Does somebody want to share what the Good Samaritan law in Vermont is? No? Well, it's just a law that says if you respond to somebody in good faith, try to save their life with CPR or other types of interventions, you're not at risk for criminal penalty. Like if you, we have it in the chat here from Angel. Yeah, it protects you if you help, exactly. So if you give someone CPR and break their ribs, you're not going to be charged with assault. And that extends to overdose in many states. So if you call 911 for an overdose event, you're not at risk for prosecution for small amounts of drugs and paraphernalia. Oftentimes doesn't apply to like child endangerment issues and things like that. But really, call 911 and know that it's safe. When first responders come to an overdose event, they're not trying to arrest people, they're trying to save people. And so it's really important for people who are using to know it's safe to call 911 during overdose because of Good Samaritan laws. And so how can someone reduce their risk? This kind of loops back to harm reduction a bit. Medications. So the FDA approves 3 medications for opioid use disorder. Naltrexone is an opioid blocker, just like naloxone. It can be a daily pill or a 28-day injection of Vivitrol. Works for a lot of people. Some people have a negative reaction to the blocker. The different brain chemistry, different, etc. Buprenorphine, or name brand Suboxone, is a partial opioid agonist compounded with naloxone. Most easily accessible, readily available treatment for opioid use disorder. It reduces cravings and helps people to manage their withdrawal symptoms while they stabilize. Some people will be on it for the rest of their life because of opioid dependence. Some people do really well short term. A lot of people are on it for 1 year, and as they, manage their chemical dependency, the world around them fills up and they're able to taper off of opioids once they're no longer self-medicating. And, some people think of their Suboxone as like an antidepressant. Some people think of it as like a heavy opioid. We all have relationships to drugs, and it's about, that knowledge of self and that knowledge of substances. And buprenorphine works great for a lot of people. Methadone works great for a lot of people too, but it's largely inaccessible because in America we use the methadone clinic model where people go to be dosed and monitored every day. And not everybody can wake up at 5 a.m. to go to a methadone clinic every day forever. But really, conversations about office-based methadone, so going to a doctor like you would for your Suboxone for methadone, it seems to be helping a lot of people, especially in Canada and Europe. And they're starting to look at it here now with this new federal guidelines with methadone. More can be due to enhance access to treatment options, because at the beginning we talked about giving people options and they're honoring their agency to define their path of recovery. But pretty much, Vivitrol is readily accessible through primary care. Suboxone or buprenorphine is more and more accessible. Methadone. And who knows, we could throw many things into this: yoga, acupuncture, meditation, cannabis, on and on and on. But for people who are still using, I usually throw one or two of these things at them. Don't use alone, go slow, don't mix your drugs, especially alcohol or benzos or other depressants. Limit use while sick. So if you have an illness that affects your lungs and you're already lower blood oxygen, you're at a higher risk for overdose. So as we look at raising overdose rates in times of COVID-19, I'm wondering what the impact is. Drinking water. Water is harm reduction. Everybody should drink more water in America. It's really funny. We pay a lot for water and we don't drink enough of it. But yeah, water is harm reduction because it increases blood flow. It keeps you, just helps your body protect itself. And a lot of the fatal overdoses that are actually examined by a coroner find many underlying health conditions that weaken the body to a point where the drugs, just overcame the system. But it's typically not one drug. It's typically not one health condition. Of course, that does happen, but most of the overdoses are multiple kind of health situations going on that, again, could be prevented with harm reduction. And so at H2RC, we give out fentanyl test strips. I kind of talked about that a bit. And of course, know the signs of an overdose. And if you're using opioids, for the love of God, please carry naloxone or know how to use it. How do we obtain naloxone? We can certainly have some people on this call shout out that they can help you get it. Certainly reach out to me if you're having issues with access to naloxone in Windsor County. Happy to help you. But there's many agencies giving it out, hospitals giving it out. Really, really good stuff. So I have probably 9 or so minutes I want to spend talking about a couple of quick things, and then I really want to open it up for folks to wrap it our 90 minutes. Would anybody like to share anything, questions or comments about opioids before we talk about stimulants for really briefly?
Ryan, it's Melanie. I just want to mention that I'm going to look there is a state of Vermont website that shows where Narcan distribution sites are, and there's a map. So I will put that link in the chat.
Thank you. Anyone else before we wrap up this morning? Again, you'll have time at the end to be heard here. Just want to open it up for folks. So more overdoses have stimulants involved, polysubstance use. So we're seeing in New Hampshire this year, especially more than ever, overdoses from just stimulants, just meth or just cocaine. A lot of it, though, is polysubstance. So it may be cocaine that had fentanyl added to it or whatever it may be. People sometimes will use a stimulant for a while, which is an upper. So rather than like an opioid, it's a depressant or a downer. Stimulants increase brain activity, increase heart rate and oxygen, and really kind of speed you up quite a bit. But really similar, they affect the central nervous system like opioids, but they're a stimulant. And they release dopamine, noradrenaline, and serotonin. And methamphetamine specifically, that methyl branch blocks the reuptake of those neurotransmitters and creates a really euphoric high that really leads itself to compulsive redosing. But amphetamine type drug use is on the rise all around the world. We have a society that really values productivity and, sexual performance and a lot of things that people get from their first time using stimulants. And so we really, and what we find is that when we start treating what we think is addiction, we start treating trauma or pain or ADD or ADHD. And a lot of people with the program, the Claremont Exchange, when you really talk to them about the fact that they're injecting bath salts or cathinones chaotically, and they would prefer meth or cocaine, a lot of them started being treated for ADD, ADHD with Ritalin or Adderall, et cetera. And if you really get into it, what we know about opioids and dependency, I'm wondering why we don't see more stimulant agonist therapies to treat stimulant dependence or stimulant use disorder, because people are using these substances for a reason. They can be prescribed, they can be illicit. Methamphetamine, cocaine, really what you see is the first few uses, the first time before the neurotransmitters are really depleted in the brain, you see decreased appetite, decreased need for sleep, generally positive energy, euphoria, increased sex drive, which can be really dangerous in a lot of different ways. People are more stimulated to seek pleasure or reward. But over time and continued use, people become disinhibited. They start sweating or picking at their skin more because the drug is metabolized out of the body in a similar state that it was put into the body. And so it becomes kind of caustic as the body detoxes it out and continued use looks like more and more anxiety, compulsive redosing, decreased circulation, dehydration, irritability, jaw clenching, teeth grinding, loss of consciousness. It's a very acidic, caustic drug that really wears on people's skin and teeth over a long period of time. And I've seen people I grew up with go through this cycle in less than a year of continued use, where it starts out and this drug is great. I'm no longer dope sick. I switched from fentanyl to meth. I can work a job. I'm having the best sex of my life. A few weeks later, that starts to look a little bit different, and the addiction has kind of started to take place. And getting through this is tough because it gives people the illusion of control, and at some level, at least neurologically, it gives them autonomy and agency because it shuts down the parts of the brain that regulate survival and self-preservation and increases the drive for pleasure and control. And so people look like they're chaotic. They're literally naked in the streets running around. They're committing crimes. They're completely out of control. But their brain is saying, we're good. We're good. We're in control. We have the power. We have this, not really realizing what's going on because continued use of stimulants can really cause a lot of issues. And really, people don't understand methamphetamine, specifically the withdrawal can take up to a year to really go full cycle. We act like there's no withdrawal symptoms or a short 0 to 10 days of fatigue and depression and irritability. Hallucinations are a big part of long-term methamphetamine use. But really, we kind of forget people around the 2 to 3 week point, and they're having trouble sleeping, they're foggy, they could be aggressive, depressed. And that, up to a year, people can be depressed, lack drive for things that used to motivate them, things that used to find pleasure in are no longer pleasurable, decreased libido and sexual dysfunction. And for a lot of people in like the meth culture, that's a big part of it is sex. Like, look at our society and how much we worship sex. And so we need to open up places where people can talk about these issues and understand that a lot of people go to residential treatment where 90% of the roster is opioids, and they're told that you don't have withdrawal symptoms, but it's just simply not true. As we talk about overdose here, and we kind of wrap up, stimulant overdose doesn't look like an opioid overdose where the person is unconscious or unresponsive. They're actually very responsive. They're going to be overheating. They could be very dehydrated, sweating, flailing limbs, trouble seeing. They could be frothing at the mouth or drooling. The vibrating vision, where you can see their eyes moving back and forth. They could have difficulty breathing. And so this could become a respiratory event. This could overwhelm the system. You could have a stroke or a seizure, organ failure. But really, like working in Manchester specifically, a lot of people I would see in the streets day to day were overdosing on meth, and they didn't know it was an overdose because when they started using, many people are told, you can't overdose on this. Do a 0.5 gram shot and see what happens. And then it's 2 days later and they're in a psych ward and they have no idea what's been going on. But really, they could be hallucinating. They could be aggressive, confused, and long-term psychosis. And that's a great question, Melanie. Narcan will not touch a stimulant overdose. What we're seeing is people who are saved by an opioid overdose by naloxone, that stimulant is still on board. So they could come up pretty awake. But if somebody is overdosing on stimulants, we want to get medical professionals there, and they're dehydrated and overly hot. So we want to see if they can drink some water, and we want to remove stimulus from their environment because they could be hallucinating, not in consensus reality. They could be paranoid or confused. And so we want to remove any unnecessary people or lights or sounds, make sure they feel safe, and offer them water or a cool cloth to put on, their neck or their armpits or behind their knees. We really want to cool them down. So a fan, air conditioner, make sure they're comfortable. Never try to restrain somebody who's overdosed or is on drugs, whether that's opioids or stimulants. Their executive functioning in their brain is not running at 100%. And so if somebody tries to run, just let them run. Don't try to restrain them or hold them back. And soft messaging, supportive messaging, body language is important too. Like if they perceive you as a threat, you really want to be facing to the side. Like you don't want to be facing at them directly. You really want to make sure they feel safe and comfortable so that they can calm down. And for medical folks, a stimulant overdose, sometimes the best thing is a benzo, Ativan, whatever. I'm not a clinician. I don't know how to prescribe benzos, but for people who respond to overdoses on stimulants on a regular basis, the benzo is the golden ticket for a lot of those situations, at least short term. Harm reduction for meth, similar to opioids, self-care, stay hydrated, water, take breaks, avoid mixing substances. Magnesium supplements help with the long-term impact of amphetamines. It helps to reduce jaw clenching. Drug checking, go slow on a new supply. A new cotton filter. There's a lot of bacteria and skin conditions that come from injecting meth, and there's a whole kind of tutorial we could get into on injection practices. But just know the risks, know yourself, and know your drugs. And pretty much wrapped up here. I definitely want to share this PowerPoint slide deck with you all. I have a couple of last slides I can kind of slowly toggle through, but by all means, please, I would love to hear from folks if you have any questions or comments. Thank y'all for listening to me. Hopefully this was helpful. Definitely available for more of these, so happy to hear from y'all if you have anything to say.
Ryan, you did an excellent job. What everyone doesn't know is that I was ruthlessly pinging him about the time, and I was terrible, and I'm sorry about that. But you squeezed it all in, and everyone, I think it's a great presentation. Questions? I did put in the chat, if you're interested in receiving the slide deck and the recording, please do the evaluation that I put in the chat, or you can email me directly at melanie.sheehan@mahhc.org. This was an open invitation, so while I have your name and maybe your organization, I don't have everyone's email. So we want to stay connected, and the best way to do that is the evaluation. How about comments for Ryan from anyone?
It's just as I scroll through these last ones, I always like to emphasize that be mindful of your expectations or preconceived notions on drugs and drug use with that stuff, and really not only autonomy and agency, but consent. Do you consent to these services? Do you consent to me helping you? We fail to have conversations about consent throughout our society. And if people are coming to treatment to, do away from drug taking behavior that gives them a sense of, individual identity and consent, and you take that away from them, it's really counterproductive. And don't punish honesty. I think it's hard for us to have really open and honest conversations about drug use. So it's really just about not punishing honesty and being a good listener. And also a whole other thing I'm starting to develop is, how do we handle grief? How do we handle our burnout or vicarious trauma? Because what I see in my life personally and professionally is the cycle of overdose, death, and grief. People are grieving and then overdosing and dying time and time again, because we don't really have a space to handle the grief that, people that provide harm reduction services or HIV services deal with on a regular basis. We're kind of told to deal with it. It's part of the job, but the power and healing of storytelling is so important in the recovery journey and in processing these things. So, connect to each other, create spaces for dialogue that have these difficult conversations, take this back with you. And definitely, I would love to continue these presentations going forward. I would love to have some folks delivering similar trainings. I'm happy to train trainers or co-facilitate with people if you want to do this kind of and run with it. MI, motivational interviewing.
Sorry, I'm just seeing that Brianna put a question in the chat that was sort of opposite to what you just asked. What are your recommendations for people who are using that are resistant to talking about it? What are the small steps when there's only a little give from a person due to chronic stigma or poor experiences with the healthcare or criminal justice system to be able to provide some strategies to get them to open up?
Really, what comes to mind, that's a really good question. What really comes to mind is my training as a recovery support worker, a recovery coach. What can we work on today to help you in your recovery? And if we use that broad SAMHSA definition of recovery, of improving health and wellness, living a self-directed life, and reaching full potential, what do you want to work on today? You don't want to talk about your drug use. You want to talk about your health care. You want to talk about your mental health. You want to talk about social connection. Like, what is it that you want to work on? And, that's the whole health model that's really effective for HIV case management, but also really effective for anybody in our society. So it's about allowing the person to define their goals and tell you, this is what I consent to working on. These are my goals that we can work on. And if we use that recovery oriented system and those philosophies, it's a lot better outcomes. It's really cool what happens. So that's a perfect question to ask. And I'm happy to explore that. I know we're at 11:30. I'm sure many of us have to get off, but happy to stay connected and explore this stuff because there's a lot more we could talk about. This was just kind of threw a lot of stuff at you. So thank you for bearing with me.
Ryan, you did a fantastic job. Thank you all for being with us. If you are interested in the Train the Trainer model, there is a question of that in the evaluation. So the channel for that, you can email me or you can do the evaluation, and there's a place to indicate that you're interested in that co-facilitation or that Train the Trainer model. So more to come. Thank you all for being with us. This was great. We had over 35 participants, which is awesome. And Ryan, can you just hang out for a few minutes afterwards? Is that okay?
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording now.